Hello and welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Aaron Porras, and coming up in today's newscast, the P5+1 indicate that the Iran nuclear deal may be dead in the water, but Israeli officials are now trying to make sure that it stays that way. Meantime, Washington puts pressure on Israel to review its rules of engagement following the release of the IDF's internal probe on the shooting of Shireen Abu Akleh. And finally, an ancient and exceedingly rare text returned to Israel after decades in the wind. Music to Israel's ears. U.S. President Biden and other high-ranking officials are reportedly conveying to Prime Minister Yair Lapid that a renewed nuclear deal with Iran is off the table for the time being.
I'm sorry to say that I am less confident today than 28 hours before about the convergence of the negotiation process and about the prospects of closing the deal.
Israeli officials quietly celebrating Wednesday as Western negotiators indicate an indefinite freeze on nuclear talks with Iran. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell adding that the Iranian response to the final draft is not constructive and that the whole process is now in danger of collapse. Apparently, Tehran's demand to end the IAEA's ongoing probes into nuclear materials at undisclosed sites is derailing the talks, which until now were seemingly inches from finalization. Meanwhile, adding insult to injury, Iran indicating that if only the probes were dropped and a deal were signed, then Tehran could fill the energy voids created in Europe by the ongoing invasion of Ukraine. But the comments smacking of extortion, as recent reports indicating secret energy deals between Tehran and Moscow to help Russia sidestep Western sanctions in the event of an accord. Now, all that said, the proviso, for now, is still worrying Israel, which is hoping to put a final nail in the coffin of the JCPOA nuclear deal. So Israeli officials are still rallying against the Ayatollah regime Tuesday. President Herzog, for one, addressing the German parliament with calls to maintain pressure on Iran in light of the Ayatollah's malignant ambitions.
גם בדורנו וגם בעת הזאת ממש, כוחות שנאה אפלים מובלים בידי איראן ומאיימים לא רק על ישראל ולא רק על היציבות במזרח התיכון, אלא על הסדר העולמי כולו. החזקת נשק להשמדה המונית בידי מדינה חברה באומות המאוחדות שקוראת יום-יום להשמדתה של מדינה אחרת חברה באומות המאוחדות היא דבר שלא מתקבל על הדעת.
And finally, Prime Minister Lapid likewise warning Iran not to test Israel's capabilities as he stands next to an Israeli F-35 fighter.
עדיין מוקדם מדי לדעת אם אכן הצלחנו לבלום את הסכם הגרעין, אבל ישראל ערוכה לכל איום ולכל תרחיש. אם איראן תמשיך לנסות, היא תגלה את ידה הארוכה ואת יכולותיה של ישראל, נמשיך לפעול בכל הגזרות, נגד הטרור, נגד מבקשי רעתנו.
Now, as Israel pressures to keep the JCPOA nuclear deal on ice, Jerusalem is also declassifying a 20-year-old mission to keep nukes out of Syria. But is this coincidence or a stern message? Joining me with more is Dr. Ori Goldberg from the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy at Reichman University. Dr. Goldberg, thank you so much for joining us. Now, let's start with the aforementioned premise. How do you interpret the timing of the declassification of Operation Orchard in 2002 and the repeated warnings from Israel against Iran? Is this coincidence?
I don't think anything has changed significantly. I think we've seen these stages in the negotiations over the nuclear agreement. I don't think the deal is off the table. I think this is time for strenuous consultations in Tehran and in Washington, D.C. And I have to say, I don't find Israel's quote-unquote messages remarkably convincing. Nothing has been done that has not been done before. Israel repeatedly strikes in Syria, hoping that this conveys to the Iranian regime the possibility of a strike in Iran. There is absolutely nothing even remotely alike between the situation in Syria and Iran. Israel lacks the capabilities to strike in Iran on its own, and it has absolutely no commitment, if anything, the opposite is true, for a credible military option, as Israelis like to call it, from the American side.
So now, with respect to freezing of the JCPOA, then, what are the chances that it actually does get signed still? Is Israel right to remain worried?
Oh, I think the JCPOA will be signed ultimately. I think there's a lot of infighting that is happening in Tehran right now. And I think that the Israeli position, again, we have to realize something about the Israeli position. There's nothing new here. This has been the Israeli position since the signing of the agreement was made public in 2015. It's been the Israeli position since before the agreement was actually signed. Nothing has changed. This government does nothing different from the governments of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So there's absolutely no reason to assume that while the agreement is so clearly a joint interest for the United States, for Iran, for the European Union, there's no reason to assume that any timely intervention on Israel's part will bring about a sea change regarding the approaches to this agreement.
All right, so do you think that Israel has anything at all to do with the current freeze, though? For example, getting the West to stand firm on its positional arguments? Or is it purely coincidence and Israel is wasting its breath?
Frankly, I don't think Israel has anything to do regarding the nuclear agreement. I think Israel's position, again, is very well known. I don't think it's remarkably appreciated in European capitals and certainly not in Washington under the Biden administration. I think Israel is blowing a lot of smoke at the moment. I think this is good for domestic political needs. I think it's good for perhaps building up national resilience. It's good for distracting attention from the rapidly escalating situation in the territories. Is there anything substantial in these strikes in Syria? I think not.
All right, so Iran has offered to supply Europe with energy if a deal is signed. But we know from previous recent reports that Iran and Russia are working on a way to launder Russian supplies through the sanctions. Does Tehran really think that the West is that stupid not to catch this obvious blackmail? And more importantly, is the West that stupid?
No, I don't think the West is that stupid. I think Iran is flirting with the Russians, as it always has done, as a means of alerting the West to the potential complications of reneging on the JCPOA, which I will remind you still stands. I think these are all tactics. The Iranians and the Russians have deep suspicions regarding each other and have had them for 250, 300 years. They are not going to be alleviated because of circumstance. The Iranians don't trust Putin whatsoever, and I have no doubt Putin shares the same mistrust. These are all attempts to force the West's hand in the negotiations. They are, I agree, fairly lame attempts, and I think the West sees right through them. I don't think Iran is going to follow through on this potential deal with Russia.
Well, so still, the West needs to take this as at least somewhat credible. So how does the West and the P5+1 feel about this potential side deal? Are they going to do? Is there any sort of contingency plan to prevent the laundering of money to Russia around sanctions in Ukraine?
Let's perform a brief thought exercise. Let's be Iranians for a second and consider the credibility of the United States as we are constantly seeing images of Israeli officials meeting with senior American politicians. Israel is the sworn enemy of this agreement. Israel has said that it reserves the capability to strike in Iran. Should Iran not sign an agreement with the United States because the United States is so clearly and visibly flirting with Israel? I don't think so. I think that Israel in this case is a sideshow. I think that the Iranian-Russian negotiations and talks are also a sideshow. I don't think that they are trivial. I don't think that they should be taken seriously. Russia is an axis for Iran. But at the moment, things are very much up in the air regarding the Ukraine as well, and Russia's status with regard to European energy, just the same.
All right, Dr. Ori Goldberg, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you.
Moving on, following the release of Israel's internal probe on the death of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, the White House is renewing pressures on the IDF to review its rules of engagement. Dr. Alex Selsky, former advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu and member of the Israel Victory Project, is with us to discuss. Thank you so much for joining us, Doctor. So, is it a serious suggestion from the United States, or is this political posturing?
Just let me correct you, please. Thank you for promoting me for doctor, but I'm not yet. Concerning your question, I don't know. Let's see. But I think that the real question is how Israel will stand this pressure, and Israel must stand this pressure. Overall, I think the whole situation, definitely in terms of advocacy, Israel shows weakness.
Hi everyone, it's Emmanuel Kadosh. I wanted to invite you all to subscribe to ILTV Plus, where you can find our daily news and updates about Israel. And not only that, but live feeds, entertainment, our kosher food show, and so much more. Needless to say, your subscription to ILTV Plus helps us grow and create more content while also supporting the state of Israel. Our app is available on all platforms and devices, so I'll see you guys there.